Okay, well, hello. Thank you for joining us today. This is a virtual panel called Justice for All, the Mutual Benefits of Restorative Practices for Victims and Youth. So if that's not what you signed up for today, unfortunately, you're in the wrong place. But you've lucked out because we have an awesome panel lined up. My name is Logan Seacrest. I'm a fellow on the Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties team at the R Street Institute. R Street is a nonpartisan public policy organization that engages in research and outreach to support free markets and limited effective government. But enough about me. Let's get to the main attraction, our distinguished lineup of panelists who thankfully agreed to join me today. We were expecting to have Dr. Carl Stoffer today. Unfortunately, I don't know if he's going to be able to join us. He's overseas in Colombia at the moment doing some important restorative work, peace building work overseas. So we'll just get started with Amia actually. Davis is a project coordinator with the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. She's an advocate for youth in the justice and child welfare systems, certified to lead and teach restorative practices. As someone with firsthand experience of the juvenile justice system, Amia has worked at both the national and state levels to advise policymakers and stakeholders on effective evidence-based practices. In 2018, Amia was selected to serve on the prestigious Annie E. Casey Foundation Juvenile Justice Youth Advisory Council. And just this past May, President Biden appointed Amia to the Federal Coordinating Council on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Congratulations, Amia. That's an amazing news. That's an amazing appointment. Would you maybe just, as we get started here, mind providing a little more detail on your background and how it led you to work on restorative justice?
Yes, Logan, thank you for that. So again, I am Amia Davis, and I am from the very windy, sunny, snowy city of Michigan, well, state of Michigan. I am previously a dual system involved young person. I was both in the child welfare as well as the juvenile justice system. And I guess I became active in this work, I'd say maybe in my early 20s. So I'm only 25, so 20. Where it really just took for a mentor to connect me with the Annie Casey Foundation. And there was an application for one of their councils where they selected 12 young people nationally to participate on their council. And I did the application and I was selected. I had always had a passion for policy, definitely with being a part of the child welfare system. And my apologies, I'm actually in the airport, but definitely being part of the child welfare system and then crossing over into the juvenile justice system. So I always had a passion for policy. I knew that I wanted to be at the forefront of talking about some of the injustices that happen when youth enter the system. So yes, here I am, and I love what I do, and I only want to continue to put young people at the forefront. Like I always say, nothing about us without us. So it's a joy to be here.
Great. Thanks for joining. We've got Marcy Mistret here as well. Marcy is a senior program manager on the the restorative justice team at Impact Justice. Prior to joining Impact Justice, Marcy was the director of youth justice at the Sentencing Project. And before that, Marcy was CEO of the Campaign for Youth Justice. So during her career, Marcy has worked on over 100 laws in dozens of states, reducing the number of youth in the adult system by more than 80%. Marcy has worked at the Institute for Community Peace, is a founding director of the DC Posse Foundation, and recently Marcy was recognized with the Board Leadership Award at the National Network for Returning Citizens and the A.L. Carlisle Child Advocacy Award. So Marcy, thanks so much for being here. Would you mind just going into a little more detail about your RJ work at Impact Justice?
Absolutely. And so nice to see you again, Logan, and to join Amia and Kimiko today. Really appreciate it. I've been in the youth justice space for quite a while, and really got here, got to Impact Justice because so many of the young people who we had sentenced to very extreme times in prison were coming home and participating in restorative justice programs. And it spoke to me really loudly that folks who were involved in serious crimes, who often involve loss of life, were coming home and looking for a different way. They were saying there has to be a better way, and this is the way that many of them found, no matter where they lived in the country. And that spoke really deeply to me. So I joined the restorative justice team here at Impact Justice. We were founded by Sujatha Baliga and really looked at building a family group conferencing model, which comes from the Maori tribes in New Zealand, to build a way that can help center people who have been harmed by crime, meet their needs, and really restore relationship. And we have partnered with folks, including Arlington, so Kamiko can talk more deeply about that, to build these programs across the country, pre-charge in 10 states. They've actually launched, though we've worked with some other communities that aren't quite at launch yet. So happy to be here to share some of those lessons, and really call other people to join us in really what I think is becoming a movement to really look at the way that we treat both people who have been harmed by crime and those who have been involved.
Great, thank you so much. Hey, it looks like Dr. Stauffer is able to join us. This is great. I'll just introduce him now. Dr. Stauffer is a senior expert on reconciliation with the U.S. Institute of Peace, with over 30 years of restorative justice experience all over the world as both a practitioner and academic. Prior to joining the Institute, he was associate professor at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University. Dr. Stauffer has also served as the academic director of the Koo Scholars Program in Switzerland and co-director of the Zaire Institute of Restorative Justice. Prior to that, Dr. Stauffer worked for 16 years in South Africa as a peace building and reconciliation practitioner. He's worked on everything restorative justice, from international peace accords to truth and reconciliation commissions to juvenile justice. And I know, Dr. Stauffer, you're joining us internationally today from Colombia, where I believe you're working on an interesting project. Are you able to share any more details about what you're working on there in Colombia?
Sure, I'd be happy to whenever it's appropriate.
Oh yeah, right now would be great.
Okay, so we're Colombia is one of the projects that we're involved with at USIP, specifically because, for those of you who are following Colombia at all, their peace process and transitional justice process is setting a number of precedents globally. And the first is that they've embedded restorative justice into their system. So they're handling really extreme atrocities of war with a restorative process lens as much as possible. And so this is a very challenging and fascinating experiment that's going on. Just to put it in perspective, yesterday and the day before, Monday and Tuesday, I was in Jopal, a particular part of where there was a public hearing for the military who had committed atrocities during the conflicts in Colombia. The hearing was set up very interestingly. They had the victims and surviving families sitting on the stage on one side, and then those who were appearing before the hearing were on the other side. This is the first time I've ever seen a hearing where they bring the two together in such a close encounter, if you will. They have had other private hearings before this. This is not the first time, but I was enthralled with the fact that each military person was sitting there because they decided they would take full responsibility. And when they stood up, there were stories from they would bounce back and forth. The victims would one victim would represent their story, and then one of the officials who's former military who committed atrocities would stand up, and I heard apology after apology, unconditional. I heard not only an apology, but a recognition of the needs of how this had torn the family apart, torn the community apart. Some really incredible historic things are happening. And of course, when you're there in the moment, which was the same as we felt in South Africa, you don't always know how significant these processes are. But I'll stop there. It was a really powerful moment of responsibility, truth-telling, remorse, and victims, survivors' voices being heard. They could interrupt, they could raise their hand, they could say, wait a minute, no, my father was not an informant. What evidence do you have? You know, this kind of conversation is happening. A very powerful, difficult to manage. And so my hat's off to the HEP, the special jurisdiction that's handling this. They have some really amazing magistrates who are trying to moderate these processes. I'll stop there.
Well, great. Thank you so much for being able to join us despite you're obviously very busy. So thanks for joining despite your important work there. We'll go to Kimiko now. Kimiko Leidy is Executive Director of Restorative Arlington. She's been an innovator in peace building, conflict resolution, and nonviolent communication for over a decade. Her academic work at George Mason focused on conflict analysis and resolution. She holds certificates in restorative justice facilitation, peace circles, organizational development, conflict resolution, and mediation. As ED of Restorative Arlington, she works to promote empathy within the criminal legal system. In 2020, Restorative Arlington started as a kind of a grassroots initiative, and it has since evolved into its own full-fledged nonprofit engaged in community-based restorative justice practices. So welcome, Kimiko. It sounds like Restorative Arlington is a relatively new organization, so I just wanted to ask how it's going so far.
Logan, thank you so much for having me. So Restorative Arlington is very new, and we are really going through these sort of early years where we are really focused on building capacity, on creating sustainability for our work, and on sort of carefully documenting every step that we take so that we can learn quickly from anything that we do that maybe could have been done differently or better. We're really concerned with the accountability and transparency within our community and making sure that we are providing responsive services to our community. So overall, I would say that it's going really well. We are really grateful to have a leaderful organization with dozens of volunteers, many of whom have been with us since the working groups back in 2020. And have continued to be involved in a variety of ways.
That's great. All right, so intros out of the way. I think we're going to have a great discussion today. We're ostensibly here to talk about my new restorative justice policy paper that just came out with the same title as today's panel. I may be a bit biased here, but I think the paper rules. It's a great read. Don't wait for the movie. Go to our street's website and download it. But in the meantime, please, if you have questions, add them to the Q&A box. We've also opened up the chat, so you can put them in there. I'll try to monitor both. But yeah, if you have questions for the panel, put them in the Q&A box, and I'll make time for them at the end of today's discussion. So starting off, I'll admit when I first started this project, I was fairly skeptical, actually, about the whole concept of restorative justice. Our street kind of comes at things from a center-right perspective. So public safety and limited government are really the lens I use to evaluate public policy. But, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that restorative justice really aligns with center-right principles. For example, it emphasizes personal responsibility, cost-effectiveness, limited government intervention. At our street, those are kind of the qualities we look for in public policy. Yet, the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system is an area where those values are really put to the test a lot of the time. So one of the things I really like about restorative justice is that it minimizes the state's role in the lives of individuals. It reduces the need for this extensive state intervention by a professional legal bureaucracy. I kind of like to think of it as a criminal justice industrial complex. So that is a system that kind of disincentivizes victims and young people from engaging in meaningful communication with each other. And in contrast, restorative justice really recognizes that people who are most affected by a crime are best equipped to determine a just outcome. So that's kind of where I'd like to start, maybe with some definitions. I think that can be useful to kind of orient us. So I'd like to just open it up and ask y'all how you define restorative justice, because I think that phrase means a lot of different things to different people. So how do you define it, and what are some of the key differences from a traditional juvenile justice approach? And I don't know, Kimiko, let's start with you.
Thank you. So when someone asks me about what restorative justice practices is, it's always a hard question because it's a really big topic with a really broad range of processes and practices. And what I land on is that fundamentally restorative justice is a way of engaging in relationship that is concerned with the individuals, yes, but also with the relationship between them, and valuing and tending to that relationship in a really intentional way. And so compared to different processes to address conflict resolution, I would say that restorative justice is an alternative dispute resolution practice where participants have the ability to co-create both the process and the outcome in a way that makes space for the definition of justice that the person harmed holds most dear. And so in the criminal legal system, just by way of comparison, in a court process, which is sort of what we traditionally think of here in the United States as the mechanism for delivering justice to a victim of crime. In a court process, there is a judge who and a jury and a whole system set up. So the process is preset. The person who is harmed has no ability to determine what the process will look like. And then the outcome is decided again by either a judge or a jury, not again by the person who was harmed. And restorative justice allows that person harmed to have a meaningful say in what the outcome is, what justice looks like to them, what healing and safety and repair looks like to them. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Does anyone else want to weigh in on how you define restorative justice? I guess Dr. Stauffer?
Sorry, there's been some power outages. I'm really apologizing for coming in and out.
Oh, no problem at all. We understand. Yeah.
So I don't know what's been said. I often have folks ask, like, what is your elevator speech? Which is really hard to have an elevator speech for restorative justice. So I've come to using the three main questions that Dr. Howard Zehr put forward, and that is, I basically start out for someone who doesn't know what restorative justice is to say, restorative justice asks a different set of questions and therefore arrives at a different set of solutions, and then sort of talk to what is the harm, what are the needs that have arisen from that harm, and whose obligation and responsibility is it to repair that harm. And if those three are taken seriously and the right voices are brought around the table, it'll lead us to a different place, both individually as well as systemically, or in the structures, because that allows for a conversation to happen at an individual responsibility level and also a collective level.
Right. Yeah, and that's in contrast, of course, to the traditional justice system that's more concerned about who is to blame and what their punishment should be, essentially. So yeah, I think that kind of the question framework is useful in distinguishing the two. Anybody else want to wait? Marcy, yeah, go ahead.
I think my colleagues here answered that question really well, but just to take it one step further, I do think the importance is really focused on our interconnectedness as humans. And I think especially now, we really need to focus on building that again, right? It's been fractured. We've got the US Surgeon General talking about how isolated and disconnected people are for each other. And I think restorative justice is another way to rebuild, reconnect those relationships, because that is essentially what it's trying to do, to put us back in right relationship with the other person, ourselves, our families, and our communities, as Dr. Stoffer alluded to. The one thing I just wanted to add to that is that I think, you know, at Impact Justice, a lot of the groups that we're working with are young people under the age of 25. And I just want to say all of the aspects of restorative justice line up really nicely with that adolescent framework. Not to say it can't be used, obviously it can be used in all sources, but you know, it really just allows for an opportunity, you know, building strong and trusting relationships with people in the community, looking at people's strengths, age appropriate accountability and responsibility, ability to build empathy, and allow you to try again to right your wrong. And I think all of those are things that we shouldn't lose when we're talking about why this makes sense to use today and use more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. You know, another thing that I really like about restorative justice, especially when thinking about it from kind of a center-right perspective, is the emphasis on victims. You know, I think one of the greatest sources of frustration for victims often can be difficulty in just getting basic information about their cases. But, you know, when you're actually involving them directly in the process, they are able to get answers from the source itself, which is I think, huge when it comes to moving past victimization and becoming a more of a survivor. So I wanted to ask y'all, why do you think victims are so important to the restorative process, and what are the challenges that you've seen that arise when trying to engage them? We'll just maybe go around my screen. Kamiko, if we could start with you again, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so on the like conferencing level for like an individual harm, right? We call this a targeted intervention. The victim of crime is really the person who knows best what they need in order to find justice and to heal and to move forward. So we really try to address this sort of this concept that there are 5 areas of healing and harm. And so we try to look at financial harms, at physical harms, at spiritual or existential harms. We talk about the psychological and mental harm, and the social and emotional harm that the person has experienced. And then we look for opportunities within those areas where there are strengths in resources, in family, in connection, internal strengths that can help this person heal. We also look at questions, just like you mentioned. What are the questions this person needs answers in order to move forward, in order to regain a sense of peace and safety? And then we look at their values. We look at the things that they hold most dear, the things that can be sort of familial, cultural, religious, specific to their way of life, and what they value and how those values may have been shifted by the harm, and what we can do to support them in reestablishing their sense of like, I can move through my life and honor my values and live into my values in a really robust way. And there's no way to do all of that without the victim of crime. And so they're really essential. I will state one challenge that we deal with is that it takes time to build trust with a victim of crime. And that sort of sacred trust is what enables us to move through the process. And there can be, especially here in, you know, just outside of Washington, D.C., a lot of really well-educated, quick-moving people. Having the patience to go through that process can be a challenge. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, Amia, please weigh in anytime. Yeah, what's your experience?
So first, I just kind of want to speak on the side of restorative practices as far as the importance. I have seen restorative practices be implemented in many different ways, whether it's the school system, whether it's with juvenile justice individuals or child welfare. And I think that one of the most important things, and maybe even a struggle when it comes to restorative practices, is building that community and building that trust long before harm has even came about. How can we allow ourselves to build those relationships with the community so that they know, we're here to restore and repair harm, and almost leading by example. I would say it's just like and I want to make sure that I'm pronouncing your name right. Kamiko said, it's really about the strength and resources in the community. When we implement these restorative practices, this not only allows individuals to handle these type of interactions or situations on their own without anyone intervening or without any judicial systems intervening, but it also is a generational thing. It teaches children how to interact with each other. It teaches parents, just debunking and relearning how to parent and how to handle certain situations with children and things of that such. I think that just regaining a sense of peace and safety is the most important thing. When we think about restorative, we're thinking about restoring, where we're repairing something that may have already been broken. I enjoy restorative practices so much because not only do the victims have this opportunity to be able to have some healing in restoring. Those that may have committed harm also has an opportunity to have some healing and restoring as well. Oftentimes I see that when we have a victim and someone who may have caused harm, we find out that the person that caused harm had some similar issues as the concurrent victim. They face things like financial instabilities, they face things like homelessness, and one of the we've all probably heard the cliche that hurt people hurt people. So just being able to identify when there is harm, working together as a team, realizing that victims, experience harm as well. And how can we come up with a plan as a community, as partners on repairing harm together? This happened to me, and explaining how maybe it may have harmed me or hurt me, and the person that caused the harm being able to realize the cause and effect. And now let's think about how we can help you better yourself and prevent you from creating any more harm. So as just a mother, restorative practices move me. I have toddlers and I even practice on them sometimes, like, let's sit down and this is what happened, and of course a little bit more micromanaging, but just teaching them to be able to just think through their thoughts and think through their emotions and feelings. And, even as adults, sometimes do we say that we're sad, and do we really know why we're sad? Or do we say that we're angry, and are we really able to identify what caused our anger? And then when we sit down and we actually break it down, we say, hey, I may have caused this harm onto someone because I felt these emotions. And it's just a breakdown of being able to centralize your emotions, your feelings, and cause and effect. What made you feel this way, and what made you have this type of reaction? So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Stauffer, I'd like to get maybe your perspective. You've worked with victims who have been subject to, war crimes, some of the worst acts imaginable. How do you think about the challenges of engaging with victims, and what's your experience been with that population?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how I can make this a more succinct type of response. I mean, I think the bottom line is, I was looking at some of the other questions in here. Is there too much burden put on the victims? I think the one thing that has to be the bottom line and clear is no one is forced into this. And so if a victim says absolutely not, I don't want anything to do with this, I hope they rot in jail. We're happy to try to educate and work with it, but we're not going to make them sit down with anyone who's going to re-traumatize them again. And so this then, that voluntariness becomes really, really important at the level of higher atrocities, for sure. I think what's really important is that as victims begin to understand how this will answer some of the questions that the criminal legal system will not give them, they can group together and begin to advocate in ways that otherwise they probably would have been more splintered and isolated. And so the more we can bring groups, collectivized voice of the victims into a process, the better. I think one of the biggest challenges everywhere I go, not just in the US, which is very punitive in its criminal legal system. Here in Colombia, the same, they call it the ordinary legal system. But whatever you call it, we've all been steeped in it. We've all drunk the Kool-Aid, whether we've liked it or not. And so that's one of the biggest challenges, is helping or trying to help victims' communities really reflect on what are my needs, because what I've been told all my life is get these people behind bars and throw the key away, and then we'll feel better. And then what we're discovering now is we don't feel better. The trauma stays, the pain stays, the frustration stays. There's been research on that, 5-year longitudinal research that has indicated. And so what we're looking at is satisfaction, is the word I like to use, and or vindication in a legal sense. And there's so many creative ways that can be done that the criminal legal system doesn't make space for. For instance, again, I'm going to come back to Colombia right now. Just in the last 2 days, it was so powerful to hear the victims say, "You humiliated my family. And we were stigmatized as a community, and what you need to do is restore the dignity of my family." And there was very symbolic ways, because the cameras were rolling for the whole nation to be watching this televised. And so one of the things that happened, which was a beautiful sort of say the name campaign here in Colombia, they would read out the name, and this was the perpetrator or the offender reading the names after each name, and he would say, "And you were innocent. You were not part of the criminal or other activity that we accused you of or falsely accused you of. And your family's name," trying to bring that dignity back to the lost ones. And it was can't remember the exact wording, but it was very powerful when that was repeated after every name, basically an exoneration for the family at that time.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. That's an incredible story. One of the things I go into the paper, and Marcia, you touched on this earlier. I go into the story of New Zealand, which in the late 80s was basically in like full-blown crisis mode. They had rising youth crime, overburdened juvenile courts, one of the highest incarceration rates of indigenous young people in the world. So to address the situation, members of parliament traveled to some of the Polynesian communities throughout the country and discovered that, the indigenous people of New Zealand were doing RJ long before the term was even invented. For the Maori tradition, judges don't really dispense punishment down from on high. Instead, the whole community is more involved in addressing conflict. And since that time, since the 80s, New Zealand has run its entire youth justice system based on restorative principles. They've been able to downsize the system dramatically, and it's probably the best example of how an entire country can transform their system using restorative justice. So I want to kind of get on at the fact that, for centuries, indigenous populations have relied on restorative principles to respond to wrongdoing. So what do you think we can learn from these cultures and practices? Kimiko, I thought I'd start with you here. When I talked to you initially, you talked about this idea of breathing smoke of the same fire, which I just love that phrase. So if you could just kind of like describe what that means and what we can learn from indigenous cultures.
Yeah, thanks, Logan. I think that in my mind, one of the things that RJ does is really commit to the idea that every person is essential for what they bring and who they are. And that we recognize this better when we are experiencing something together. And so the idea of breathing the smoke of the same fire, that we are experiencing the same thing at the same time. We have this joint sensory experience that in some way elevates our experience to sort of a joint spiritual experience, and that we can recognize the depth of our connection through that moment. And this is sort of the concept that we try to replicate in restorative justice practices. Rarely here in the United States do we have an opportunity to gather around a fire and address a conflict. And so we try to replicate this in a broad range of ways. And what I would say is that the process of storytelling can often serve that sort of unifying force for people, that the process of telling our story first individually, but then also together and sort of co-creating a story of what happened that that can help us move forward. Something that we can all say, yes, I understand that. I was part of that. I see myself in that story. And I can see a future for myself and my community and my loved ones through moving through that story.
Great. Marcy, you brought up New Zealand earlier. Would you like to touch on some of the work that Impact Justice has done around that country's system?
Yeah, and so I'd be happy to do that. So I think one of the most important things I can say about the impact justice model is that we really strongly believe that these processes have to be held by community. They have to be, held outside of the system by the community in circle processes, right? The idea of a circle process is based in in principles of shared power instead of a power over, which is very much our adversarial system. And I have to say that when we talk about healing, we have that very basic connection that Kamiko's talking to about connecting to your ancestors and connecting to your culture and understanding. People don't come into circle alone. They come in with neighbors, they come in with family members, they come in with the supports, right? That they need to address that harm. And if we think about that Indigenous practice and the importance of that culture, advancing healing is really, really important. We know trauma lives in our DNA for 7 generations. When we look at our legal system in the United States, our BIPOC youth are tremendously overrepresented, including Indigenous youth. Indigenous youth, they come from cultures that use these practices fundamentally and that have been systematically eradicated in the name of assimilation. So bringing that back, helping people reconnect to that is really an important journey for folks to go on. And I do just want to emphasize again, New Zealand, incredibly, it's what our model was built on. And I do want to say they've had, Dr. Stauffer talked about this, they've had model drift because it remained in the system instead of in the community, and incarceration rates for Maori youth are going right back up. So I just want to give that a little bit of a caution.
Yeah, no. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I just think it's so cool that RJ is really one of the oldest ideas that we have in the criminal justice system. I kind of view this long history as an example of the Lindy effect. I'm not sure not everyone may know what the Lindy effect is, but it's basically like the longer an idea survives, the more kind of objectively useful it can be said to be for civilization. So only the strongest ideas survive over time. The length of an idea's life is kind of representative of its value. This was initially actually observed in the context of Broadway shows. So the longer a show had run, the longer it could be expected to remain on stage. So this was the Lindy effect, as it was named after Lindy's restaurant in New York, where Broadway performers gathered. So like a good musical, restorative justice has, remained on stage for a reason after all this time. I think at this point, something like 45 states have enacted laws either supporting restorative justice, and 35 have actually implemented it into the formal juvenile justice system. One of the states my paper highlights is Nebraska, which has actually invested heavily in restorative justice, a red state, that has invested heavily in restorative justice. And youth there who participate have a 15% lower recidivism rate compared to those who don't. So, but despite this success, I still feel like most restorative justice programs in the United States, particularly, remain kind of limited in scope. They're only available to first-time offenses or misdemeanor cases, minor crimes. I wanted to ask you all if you think restorative justice can be applied in more serious cases or those involving violence, and how that should be handled. Maybe Dr. Stauffer, we could start with you on that one.
Well, in some ways, the stakes are higher the more serious the offense, and there you see the more if it's handled well, you see actually the incredible power of transformation. So I have co-facilitated in a homicide situation. We were not a diversionary homicide situation, so the punitive system was still going forward, but this was between families whose children wanted accidentally in peripheral violence around gangs had killed the other accidentally, meaning he stabbed him but not meant to stab him to death. And there's a whole set of circumstances around that. And these two families lived in the same community. They were friends. It just so happened, this was in South Africa. It just so happened one of them was a Muslim family and one was a Christian family also. So there's a lot of dynamics going on there. And yet there was a lot of attention. Their children, were going back to the same school, and so and word was spreading, and there was a lot to be done. So the process there, we changed our goalposts. Obviously, it was to keep the conversation open, keep the families in conversation, and to try to help keep anything from spinning out of control for revenge cycles, etc., coming back into the community. So that was much more of a relational focus and a relational healing focus. And it was really critical that we did that, even though that was running in parallel to the criminal legal system. Ultimately, and we don't know if there was a direct impact because the criminal legal system didn't want to completely acknowledge what was happening here, but ultimately the young man who committed the stabbing was given the lowest degree sentence, meaning unintentional murder, and we're not, and he was a juvenile, so he was 14, so also he was handled in a very different way. But the question that you ask is yeah, really important. I think we are finding ways to use it, and in some ways the stakes, like I said, the stakes are higher. There's more interest at the higher level crime. One of the things we did we had a coalition, a restorative justice coalition that we started in Harrisonburg, Virginia, with our police. And the police were adamant too, said, let's not limit this to just misdemeanors, because there are certain felonies that could be handled really well with this that right now are exempt completely because we put that kind of artificial barrier there. An example being two women who go to the same church and they went into business together. The one defrauded, who was handling the money, and the other one said, I don't want them in prison, but I want them to stop and I want my money back, and obviously, not to do business with them anymore. And we need to have that conversation. I don't need someone to go to prison and be drugged through the process. That was a felony, though. The amount of money that was embezzled was a felony charge. And so this kind of thing is critical for us to start talking about. And what we need, and I know, I think impact justice, I'll let Marcy talk about more of that, but I know that one of your criteria is complete diversion, that this is not just diversion or a possible alternative, but complete diversion, so that the young person is being taken out of the system and handled in a different way and held accountable in a different way completely, so that they're never introduced into the formal legal system. And our police in Harrisonburg also appreciated that. We gave them a discretionary, someone talked about discretion in here and the dangers of that, but there was also the power of that, where police officers are going back to an incident that is not a major incident, that they don't want to introduce into the formal system, but they want to handle in a different way. Restorative justice gives them the tools to start handling that in a different way. I'll stop there.
Yeah, Marcy, I believe Impact Justice, one of your partners, is Community Works West, and I know they focus and kind of specialize in working with juveniles accused of more serious offenses. So I'd be interested to get your take on how we should think about restorative justice in the context of more serious crimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Stoffer gave a really great answer. I think the things that I would tend to is when you're looking at diversion, right? The youth justice system in this country, nationally, there's definitely states and jurisdictions that do better than others, but do divert a lot of low-level first-time offenses straight up, right? At Impact Justice, you have to identify that person, that there was a person harmed. That means that that is more likely to be a charge that is a person-related offense. Those are much less likely to be diverted, particularly for youth of color. So you have to be explicit about that. We have the system partners go through their data, really go through it with their community partners and say, where is this where is diversion not happening, where it could be happening, where disparities exist. And when you are somebody, tying this back to the survivor, the person that was harmed, we're asking them to come sit, to come, share their needs, share what they would like to get out of this conference. It takes time. And so we find that they're more likely to get involved in that case, in that process, in that alternative process is, as Dr. Stoff said, if the stakes are higher. I do want to just put to rest the idea that most of these charges are loss of life charges. While that is and can be in cases an appropriate thing, that is not what we are doing in the cases of pre-charge diversion, which is where impact justice sits. So we are talking about assaults, we're talking about burglars, we are talking about car thefts, which are serious charges and are often felony charges. And so it works. The data says it works better with young people on a second offense because they understand better their process. And so there's been really good outcomes. CW does have a wonderful report talking about 91% person harm satisfaction. Again, Dr. Stoffer referred to that as an indicator. We see that consistently, even over some of our sites, similar to Arlington, that is newer, still same levels of satisfaction from people harmed. It's not near that. And if you ask victims of crime how they feel about the legal system, their satisfaction rate isn't close to that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'd be interested to get your take as well. How do you think about restorative justice in the context of working with more victims of more serious crimes or as perpetrators of more serious offenses?
I think that restorative practices or restorative justice should be implemented at all levels. I think that just the bigger picture here is to restore. It's right in the word to restore. Anywhere that there is some harm, I think that restorative practices need to be implemented. And I think that again, and I'll say it, it needs to be implemented for the victim, but it's also a necessary step for it to be implemented for those that cause harm, to discontinue harm continuing to be committed. Are we going to, we're going to not only hold the space and the opportunity for victims to be able to express how things had made them feel and how it affected them, and then coming up with a set plan on how we can repair the harm, but also eliminating barriers for those that committed any harm and allowing them to think through the process and think through what may have happened to prevent any further harm. So I think that when we think about restorative practices, we really need to push the narrative of prevention, not only before it happens, but when it does happen, how can we prevent it from continuing to happen?
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks so much for that. I wanted to turn to challenges here in the last 10 minutes or so. Clearly, as we've covered today, restorative justice addresses many issues within the current system. But I do think it's important to think about some of the possible risks it poses as well. One thing I think about, for example, voluntary participation is widely seen as extremely important to restorative justice. But I feel like children may not always understand that taking part is voluntary, or they may feel pressured to take part. Consider a young person who's given the choice between a restorative justice conference or taking their chances in court with a judge. That isn't really much of a choice we're presenting them. And justice-involved youth have little power to resist that kind of pressure from authority, especially when it's backed up by a threat of punishment like that. So I was wanting to get everyone's take on how can a concern like this be addressed, and what you see as the challenges or limitations of applying restorative justice in the juvenile context specifically. Kimiko, I don't know if you want to start there. I'll just before I let you go, one of the things I think I talked about in the paper is that because restorative justice is supposed to be voluntary, and if there's an alternative, if the alternative is harsher punishment, it's not really consensual. So one way to prevent coercion on that note is for policymakers to consider making RJ the default, to address certain delinquent behaviors. Because then isn't this kind of like dichotomized system where we're sending some to restorative justice and some to the traditional system. So anyway, that was just my thought on it. But Kimiko, if you want to talk about just some of the kind of challenges and limitations of RJ in a juvenile justice context.
Yeah, I think we need to be really honest that there's not like a firm way around the problem that you are suggesting. Like, it's a real problem and we can't sidestep it. I think that in my practice, the concept of de-authoritization is really important. That when we meet with young people and their families and their loved ones and their supporters and mentors, that we are engaged with them, we're learning with them, we're talking with them. And, one of the things I look for when I'm hiring and training facilitators is people who are very comfortable with being quiet, people who are really good listeners. I think that there is a tendency with adults to slip into a mode of like coaching or teaching or looking for like the opportunity for a lesson, and resisting that that impulse as an adult doing this work is really essential. And double checking with the young people and saying, well, is that really what you want? You're offering to do this thing, and we do need to figure out what you're willing to do to make this right. But is it realistic for you to spend all of your weekends in service of this thing? Is that really going to meet a need for them and allow you to move forward in a good way, right? So just really checking in, building trust, and holding de-authoritization as a core value is really essential.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to kind of highlight a question from the chat here. Annie says, what does restorative justice look like, or is it even possible, if the victim doesn't want to engage or wants the perpetrator to be punished within the traditional system? Maybe, Marcy, do you think it's possible if, or actually, let's start with Dr. Stauffer. Do you think it's possible if the victim doesn't want to engage?
I think we have an educational opportunity that we should try to use as much as possible at that moment. But again, I was fairly clear in that, Bailey. I don't think we're not going to force anyone into a room. There is other alternatives. We have some surrogate models, some proxy models that have been used before. Videos, for instance. So you might say, would you be willing to listen to a video from this person telling their story or wanting to apologize? That can be very intrusive though too, like a letter coming from them or a video. But that could be potentially a safer move than having to face the person directly. And it could open up conversations. We've used the video dialogue process, not even just in restorative justice, but also in conflict resolution processes where the conversation was just too hard to have directly, but there was a willingness to say, okay, there'll be a third medium sort of mediating this process that possibly can bring us closer. But I mean, there's a lot of creativity that we haven't experimented with, I think, on that. If I may, while I'm just here, I think I have a fairly strong sense that we cannot force any victims in because of the trauma, my background in trauma and the re-traumatization. And there's trauma also with the offender, and in this place, a young person. But I'm slightly different in that sense that I feel like there may be a certain level of coercion that we don't know about, that they feel sort of like, what option do I have or whatever. In some cases, though, again, I'm not dragging anyone into a meeting, but there have been moments where I've said, okay, are you willing to trust the process and see where it takes us? Now, that's another thing, so that you enter into the conversation, but with the option of anyone stepping out of that at any moment when it's not comfortable anymore, and then trust that the conversation, I think all of us as facilitators have experienced this process actually transforming some thinking as we go. And so I don't want to miss that opportunity, that there could be a transformation in relationship it may start out suspicious or skeptical. It may end up at a different place if the process is done well.
Yeah, you mentioned surrogates there. One of the interesting things about Nebraska's RJ program is that they really rely on former participants to become surrogates eventually for victims. And I think that process of working through an RJ conference and then becoming involved kind of on an institutional level with it is can be really powerful for victims and people who caused harm. So yeah, we just have a few minutes left here. If you have a burning question, throw it in the chat, and I can throw it up. But just as we leave here, I just wanted to maybe just get at like what we see as like the future of restorative justice. Where is the field going? And maybe Marcy, I can start with you.
I want to echo what Amaya said a couple times here. I mean, we work closely, mostly with prosecutors' offices, and I have to say, prosecutors are elected in most places. There's been a lot of blowback to any sort of innovation or doing things differently recently. Same thing with judges. I think that moving forward, we're going to start, a lot of our sites go out into community and talk about this different framework. It's an education piece as much as it is a referral, a different behavior change in the system. And so I would say we're going to see a lot more increase from other places referring, either people self-referring to a restorative process to handle harm, other organizations, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations holding these processes versus criminal legal system. So that's something I'm seeing.
Awesome. I just want to get to this question in the chat real quick. Dr. Ryan Spahn here, he says that restorative justice methods seem to increase flexibility and discretion in responses to delinquency and crime. Unfortunately, all too often, flexibility and discretion in our justice system results in outcomes that are disproportionate across race, ethnic, and/or economic categories. How can we prevent such inequalities? Anyone want to venture an answer on that one?
I mean, I spoke to that by really using the data to identify where the biggest disparities are and making sure that those are the cases that are being referred. You can't, if you look at just diversion overall, which is where we sit in restorative justice, white kids benefit much more from diversion with the same charges, same backgrounds as other kids. So unless you are explicitly looking at charges that disproportionately impact young people of color, you will continue to disadvantage that group.
Oh, and it looks like Dr. Stauffer had to drop off here. This would be a perfect question for him. What if the community is complicit in the harm? That's a super interesting question. I don't know, Kamika, you want to tackle that at all, or it's a tough one for sure.
So I'm gonna say something. In some ways, all of our communities are complicit in harm because we live in a world where harm is built into the way that we live our lives. So I would say I almost take that for granted and say, yes, our communities are complicit in harm. There may not be a way around that. What we can do is look for sort of more details about that. What harm are we complicit in? What policies, what burdens are we placing on communities that have been marginalized and experience harm in disproportionate ways? And how do we shift that so that those communities aren't saddled with that harm over and over and over again, right? I hope that's a satisfying answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It looks like we're just about out of time here. So if you have to jump off, I totally understand. I do want to end just with a very short video that Marcy brought about some of the work that Impact Justice is doing. I think it's a great way to just kind of wrap up today's session and look at kind of RJ in action in the community. Marcy, are you able to share that with us?
Yep, just give me 1 second. Thanks, Logan.
Yeah, no problem.
The way that we're going about addressing harm and addressing crime and addressing violence is deeply flawed. It exacerbates the situation. It's not stopping the violence. As the sentencing goes up, so does the violence. There's a different way to address this.
There's been so much harm from punishing people, and it's such an old way of being. Like, it goes back into our times of slavery. More harm is being caused, and nothing's getting resolved.
At Impact Justice, we are working with communities to develop restorative justice diversion programs that support healing and accountability. From California to Philadelphia, from Nashville to New Orleans, Impact Justice is working with a network of partners to show that restorative justice is a more impactful way to build communities and keep them safe.
It's just such a step forward in terms of what we do as regards prosecution, to recognize that we have to figure out how to make people both better on the one hand, that is people who do bad things, but also how to restore people back who were victims.
There's 4 areas of harm that we were looking to address. That's the one that we have to ourselves, to our family, to our person harmed, and to our community. So we bring in people into the space that are stakeholders that are gonna help hold the youth accountable.
We help them learn what it means to account for harm that they've caused. It's not just looking at another person and saying, I'm gonna do something to you and therefore that's accountability, I held you accountable. No, we must have processes that invite people to learn what it means to account for what they have done.
I had to own up to what I did, speak about what I did, meet the person that was harmed in the instance, and you had to look that person in their face, accept that, and go about it, and that was the only way for it to be complete. It was part of the plan. Like, y'all just told me what I did, and yeah, it hurt knowing y'all just like, yeah, you did that, but you gotta hear it.
Everybody deserves second chances and redemption. Even if you feel like they don't deserve that second chance, do it for yourself.
Mistakes happen, and a part of being a person in the community is to step up and make that mistake right. Do better the next time. Help the person that you hurt and the community at large.
I get pushback a lot. Like, well, you know, you're just slapping people on the wrist. You're not doing anything. And I said, but our crime rates for our juveniles are down. In 2013, we were arresting about 4,000 kids a year, if not more. At the end of 2021, that number was down to 1,000. And that means that we're doing a lot of intervention and prevention work so that it doesn't get that way.
It's more than just about repairing the harm or reconciling differences around this specific incident. It's also about sowing the seeds that could turn into something transformative, that could change the situations and the conditions that's breeding violence and victimization in our community.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that, Marcy. I don't think that video is actually publicly available yet, but follow Marcy online to know when that is available, because I think it will be available soon, right, Marcy? Yes, coming soon.
Yes, yeah, and a longer version as well. So
great. Okay, well, I just wanted, we're out of time. Thank you so much to my panel. Like, you guys are amazing. Kimiko, Marcy, Dr. Stoffer, I think, had to jump off, but thank you so much today. And if you want to know more about restorative justice, R Street, please just visit our website, www.rstreet.org. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day.